My name is Jessica Barnes, and I'm 27 years old. Everything I'm about to tell you happened last autumn in the rugged high country of western North Carolina. I've been camping all my life, but I never believed in things like witches or Wendigo or anything that went bump in the night. I always chalked such stories up to superstition or overactive imaginations, but what my friends and I experienced in the Shining Rock Wilderness changed me forever. I guess it's best to start with why we went there in the first place. My older brother Brandon, who's 30, talked me into a week-long RV trip. He said, "Jess, you're always reading about remote places and local legends. Let's do one of your off-the-grid adventures for real." He's big into survival gear, so he was eager to test out the new gadgets he'd bought online. He's always had this way of believing he can handle just about anything. I love him for his protective streak, but it comes paired with a good dose of stubbornness. If something breaks, he'll try to fix it, even if he lacks the parts or know-how, and he'll refuse to let anyone tell him differently. We also had my best friend Maya, who is 26 and not very outdoorsy. She's the type of person who double-checks the locks on the doors before going to bed and can't sleep if she hears a single unexplained noise. Though gentle and funny, Maya can be a bit anxious. Still, I think she felt she had something to prove. She kept telling me she wanted to tough it out and push herself beyond her comfort zone. I agreed, but privately, I worried about how she'd manage once darkness fell and the forest turned ominous. Finally, there was Tyler, Brandon's friend from college. He's 29, laid back to a fault, and quick with sarcastic one-liners. Tyler's the kind of person who diffuses tension by making everyone laugh, though sometimes it backfires because he can sound insensitive if the timing is wrong. He claimed he wasn't scared of spooks or ghosts or anything else. "It's the living you gotta worry about," he'd say, wagging a finger as if quoting some wise guru. So, the four of us piled into our old RV, an aging Class C that Brandon had borrowed from a friend. The plan was simple. Drive into Pisgah National Forest, head for the Shining Rock Wilderness area, find a secluded campsite, and spend several days hiking by day, stargazing by night. I'd always heard that Shining Rock was gorgeous. Its quartz outcroppings glistened like giant gemstones under the sun, and the vistas from the ridges were rumored to be breathtaking. Hardly anyone camped up there midweek, so we figured we'd have the place to ourselves. The drive from our hometown took about 4 hours. We stopped for groceries, filled up on gas, and arrived at the forest boundaries by late afternoon. The main roads were paved for a while, but soon turned narrow and twisty. Mossy trees crowded the shoulders, leaves swirling in the wind. The day was bright, but there was an unmistakable hush among the pines. Our route skirted along portions of the Blue Ridge Parkway before we ventured onto a dirt trail that led deeper into Shining Rock territory. We saw fewer and fewer cars the further we went. Almost immediately, the RV's generator started acting up. Brandon fiddled with the wiring while parked on the side of the road, but nothing changed. When we tried the interior lights, they flickered erratically. "Don't worry," he told us with forced confidence. "I'll figure it out once we set up camp." We found a pull-off area that looked just wide enough for the RV and a small camp. Trees loomed overhead, and an unmarked path disappeared downhill to a creek. Through the thick foliage, you could see glimpses of the mountain ridges shining in the distance. It felt strangely isolated, just what we wanted. I hopped out to inspect the spot. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet leaves. A hush fell around us, broken only by the distant rush of water and the rustle of branches. I smiled, excited to be away from noise and busyness, while Maya looked nervous but tried to hide it. We spent that first afternoon gathering firewood and organizing the gear. Brandon fussed with the generator some more, but it refused to fully cooperate. The overhead lights stayed dim and tended to sputter as though on their last legs. Tyler teased him. "So much for the great survivalist? Gonna try rubbing 2 sticks together to get electricity?" Brandon shot him a withering look, and that was the end of Tyler's commentary, for a moment anyway. As dusk approached, I led Maya to collect more kindling for our campfire. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if she expected something to jump out from behind every tree. "Jess, you said there wouldn't be anyone else for miles, right?" she asked. I nodded. "That's what I'm worried about," she muttered, giving me a shaky smile. Our first evening was calm, if a bit chilly. We built a small fire, heated up some canned chili, and sat around talking about everything from old college memories to the local legends we'd found online. I mentioned I'd read something about witches or witch women said to roam these mountains centuries ago. Apparently, if you stand near certain quartz formations at night, you might hear them chanting, I recounted. Maya's eyes widened and she said, "That's not funny, Jess." Tyler smirked. "Guess we'll have to go looking for them. I could use a story for my next bar meetup." Brandon just rolled his eyes. "It's all nonsense, I'm telling you. People love to make up scary stories when they're alone in the woods." We turned in fairly early. The flickering of the generator lights unnerved me, so I used my flashlight to settle into the RV's small bunk. Maya slept in the top bunk, and I could hear her shifting restlessly. Brandon and Tyler shared a fold-out bed in the back. At some point, I drifted off to the rhythmic chirp of crickets and the soft murmur of the creek. Hours later, a different noise woke me up. It was a strange, hollow scraping sound along the RV's exterior. A hush seemed to have fallen over the forest. No more crickets, no wind, just that faint scrape, scrape, scrape. My heart pounded. I clicked on my flashlight and listened harder, but the sound stopped. At first, I convinced myself it was just a branch or some small animal scuttling by. I drifted back to sleep, telling myself not to worry. The next morning, I woke to Brandon's agitated voice outside the RV. "Guys, get out here," he yelled. I stumbled out, still rubbing the sleep from my eyes, Maya right behind me. Tyler joined us a few seconds later, pulling on a hoodie. Brandon stood by the side of the RV, pointing at something in the dirt. I blinked to clear my vision and saw what looked like footprints. Long, human-looking footprints, but with bizarre pointed indentations. The toes, if that's what they were, extended several inches too far to be normal. They circled the vehicle, trailing off into the thick underbrush. Tyler crouched down to examine them. "This is some weird joke, right?" But it didn't look like a prank. The prints were deep enough to suggest something heavy or large had walked there. Maya stepped backward, hugging her arms. "You guys, did you hear anything last night?" I nodded slowly. I thought I heard scraping, but I figured it was just a branch. Brandon tried to keep his composure. "Maybe it was a bear or something with messed up paws. Let's just be careful." He walked around, looking for more tracks. We followed them for a few yards, but they vanished where the undergrowth thickened. We decided to brush it off, but I could see the tension in everyone's eyes. Our plan for the day was to do some hiking. I wanted to see the quartz outcroppings that gave Shining Rock its name. We packed light, water, some snacks, a first aid kit, flashlights, and a map. Brandon insisted on bringing a hunting knife, just in case. We set out on what we believed was the Art Loeb Trail, though the signage was poor. The trees along the path soared overhead, their branches forming a dim canopy. Every now and then, a shaft of sunlight broke through, illuminating the ferns and moss below. Maya lagged behind, so I hung back to keep her company. She was looking around as though anticipating some hidden watcher behind every tree trunk. "It's too quiet," she whispered. And indeed, it was. The wind rustled the leaves, but there was hardly any birdsong. Even squirrels seemed absent. I tried to reassure her. "We're probably just scaring off the wildlife by talking." She offered a shaky nod. After a few miles, we reached a ridge with a stunning view. The mountains rolled out in layers of green and gold. You could see patches of quartz shining near the peaks. We took photos and snacked on granola bars. Tyler made a show of calling, "Hello, any witches out there?" into the distance. His voice echoed back, but nothing else stirred. Brandon scoffed at him. "Be careful what you wish for." On the way back, a dense fog rolled in, completely unpredicted by any weather app. The trail, once clear, began to feel claustrophobic. The moisture clung to our clothes, and our visibility shrank to about 20 feet. Brandon tried to be the beacon, forging ahead with confident strides. Maya and I stayed close, trying not to stumble. Tyler followed behind, occasionally calling out jokes about how this was classic horror movie weather. If he was nervous, he tried not to show it. It took us much longer to return to the RV than we'd planned. By the time we did, the fog was so thick that the vehicle's outline was just a hulking shape in the gloom. As soon as Brandon unlocked the door, we noticed the lights flickering more erratically than before. The generator sputtered loudly, then quit altogether. Tyler groaned. "We might need to fix that, or we'll be eating cold beans for dinner." Brandon's jaw was set in frustration. "I'll see what I can do, but the wiring is shot." Night fell early under the blanket of mist, so we decided on a quick dinner. I heated soup on a small propane stove outside, while Brandon tinkered with the RV's electrical system. The gloom felt stifling. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the dark silhouette of the trees. Suddenly, a twig snapped. I whirled around, pot handle in hand, but saw nothing except swirling mist. My pulse hammered. I half expected to see those strange footprints again, or worse, the thing that made them. We ate quietly inside the RV, using lanterns for light. The conversation was subdued. Maya asked if we should maybe move to a more populated campsite. Brandon shook his head. "We're fine. We just have some technical issues, that's all." She didn't look convinced, but let it drop. At some point, Tyler noticed a few items missing. His canteen, a small flashlight he'd left on the table. At first, he accused Brandon of taking them to tinker with, but Brandon denied it. I looked around, but the items were nowhere to be found. Maya whispered, "Maybe you left them outside." Tyler shrugged, obviously annoyed. "I guess so." We decided to turn in, hoping things would be clearer by morning. But that night, the eerie calm returned. I lay awake, listening for the slightest sound. Hours seemed to crawl. Eventually, I slipped into a light doze, only to snap awake again at a rustling outside. My heart sped up. Was this real, or my imagination? I heard Maya stirring overhead. Then a sudden thump rattled the RV. Brandon and Tyler woke up with startled shouts. We all grabbed flashlights, fear pounding in our chests. The thump came again from near the door. Brandon hissed, "Quiet!" motioning us to stay still. In the silence, we heard a low hiss, like a burst of compressed air, but carrying a guttural edge that suggested an animal. Or something else. It was Maya who glanced out the small window first. She clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide with terror. I crawled forward, trying to see over her shoulder. In the beam of her flashlight, a figure stood just outside the RV. It was tall and angular, the limbs seeming too long for its torso, the head partially hidden beneath stringy hair or fur. I couldn't tell which. The glow of our lantern reflected in two dull, yellowish eyes. As soon as the light touched it, the thing pivoted away, lurching into the underbrush with surprising speed. My stomach dropped. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. Brandon swung the door open, brandishing his hunting knife, but the shape had melted away into the darkness. We stumbled out, flashlights scanning the area. Nothing, only swirling fog and the crooked silhouettes of trees. Then the stench hit me, a sulfuric reek that gagged me. Maya coughed and pressed her sleeve to her face. "What is that?" Tyler asked, shining his flashlight at the ground. Just on the perimeter of the light, I could make out fresh footprints, the same grotesque, elongated prints we'd seen that morning. "Inside! Now!" Brandon barked. We rushed back in and locked the door. Anxiety racked us, but we tried to keep calm. We talked in hushed tones about what we'd just witnessed. Brandon suggested it might be some deformed animal or maybe a crazy person living in the woods. Yet none of us could shake the feeling that we'd stared into the face of something unnatural. I sat there, the events swirling in my head. That impossible shape, those eyes. My chest tightened with fear. We spent the rest of the night in restless vigil. Tyler sat by the window with a large flashlight. Brandon had his knife. Maya clutched a hatchet we normally used for firewood. I hovered near them, switching between looking out the windows and listening in the silence. Every so often we heard rustling or a faint hiss, but the figure didn't reappear. By dawn we were exhausted and jumpy. The morning light cut through the fog, revealing new footprints around the RV, along with some streaks on the outer walls like greasy handprints. Maya looked on the verge of tears. "We can't stay here. We need to leave," she said. Tyler agreed, and so did I. Brandon pressed his lips together. "Yeah, we'll pack up," he said. "Let's just hope the RV starts." We scrambled to gather everything. The plan was to head to a ranger station or nearest town, anywhere with other people. But just as Tyler turned the ignition, it sputtered, coughed, and died. He tried again, pumping the gas. The engine made a clicking noise but refused to turn over. Brandon cursed under his breath and jumped out to examine it. He fiddled with the cables, checked the battery, tried to bypass the generator. Nothing worked. Tension flared. Maya demanded we take the route on foot if we had to. Brandon snapped back that it could be miles before we found help, and we'd be vulnerable to whatever was out there. Tyler tried to calm them both. "Look, we just need to fix the RV, then we'll be out of here in no time." Easier said than done. We found a jump kit Brandon had stashed for emergencies, but its charge was nearly depleted. Still, we had to try. For the next few hours, Brandon and Tyler attempted a patch job on the wiring under the hood. Maya and I stood guard, each holding a flashlight and a makeshift weapon. My heart hammered at every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves. The sun was up, but the area remained unnaturally quiet, like the entire forest was holding its breath. At some point, Maya clutched my arm, pointing at the tree line. A tall silhouette lurked among the ferns. It moved between the trunks with unnerving grace, half hidden in shadows. It was the same lanky shape watching us. I felt its gaze as a physical weight on my chest. Maya gasped, and it retreated. She whipped around to the guys, shouting, "It's here, hurry!" Brandon muttered a frantic curse, diving back into his repairs. Within a half hour, they managed to get the RV to crank once, then stall, then crank again. By some miracle, the engine finally roared to life. Relief flooded me. We scrambled inside, slamming the door. Tyler kept his foot on the gas, shouting, "Hold on!" as he jerked the wheel. The RV lurched forward, wheels spinning in the muddy ground. For a second, I thought we were stuck, but then the tires caught traction, and we surged onto the trail. We bounced along the rough road, the engine protesting with every turn. Branches scraped the sides, screeching like nails on a chalkboard. My stomach was knotted. I glanced out the rear window, half expecting to see that figure sprinting after us. Through the dust and the haze, I caught flickers of movement but couldn't be sure. The forest closed in on both sides, making it feel like we were driving through a living tunnel. Maya tried calling out directions from the map, but in our panic, we might have taken a wrong turn. The route we followed seemed narrower, more overgrown. The further we went, the more the feeling of dread built in me. At one point, the RV's right side dipped violently into a rut. The vehicle's frame groaned, and I thought we might flip. Tyler managed to keep us steady, but the engine coughed and sputtered. We were dangerously close to losing power again. Branches battered the windows. Fog drifted in and out of the trees. Then, unexpectedly, the road opened into a clearing scattered with large quartz boulders that shimmered in the gray daylight. It was an eerie sort of beauty, but we had no intention of stopping. "Just keep going," Brandon barked. Tyler obliged, though we had no idea if the road continued or if we were just heading deeper into the wilderness. Suddenly, the shape reappeared. It darted from behind a quartz boulder, crossing in front of the RV. Tyler yelped, swerving to avoid it, narrowly missing a huge rock. We all felt a sickening thud as the tires slammed a smaller stone. The RV bucked, and we were thrown around like rag dolls. The engine sputtered and died, steam rising from under the hood. My head knocked against a cabinet, and I tasted blood in my mouth. Maya clutched her wrist, grimacing in pain. Brandon was the first to recover. He staggered to the front, tried the ignition. Nothing. The creature was gone again, but I could feel its presence lingering on the periphery. A stench of decay wafted in through the half-open driver's window. Tyler coughed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We're done for," he whispered, voice trembling. For a few minutes, none of us moved. We just stared at each other in the cramped, battered interior, hearts thumping so loudly that it practically reverberated. Then Brandon exhaled sharply and said, "We can't stay stuck here. We have to find a way out." He rummaged for tools, but everything felt hopeless. The front axle might have been damaged from hitting the rock. This time, no amount of patchwork would fix it. The haze outside had thickened, swirling around the quartz boulders like ghosts. The silence of the forest pressed in on us, broken only by our ragged breathing. Maya whimpered, holding her sprained wrist close. Tyler tried to comfort her. I pulled out the first aid kit, wrapping a makeshift bandage around it. She winced but nodded in thanks. Something slammed against the side of the RV, making the walls shudder. We all shrieked. Brandon brandished his knife, Tyler grabbed the hatchet, and I clutched my flashlight. We stared at the door, unsure if the locks would even hold. Then came a scraping, just like I'd heard that first night, but louder, more insistent. The sound traveled around the exterior, as if the entity was circling, testing every window. A faint hiss trickled in, a rasping whisper that sent chills through my blood. Maya closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. For a moment, I feared she might faint. I put a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "Stay with us, Maya." Brandon growled under his breath. "I'm not going to sit here and let that thing pick us off." Before any of us could stop him, he flung the door open. Fog rushed in, along with the rancid stench. He leapt out, knife in hand, scanning the clearing for any sign of the intruder. Tyler scrambled after him with the hatchet, yelling, "Brandon, wait!" But it was too late. I scooted to the door, shining my flashlight. The quartz reflected the beam in dizzying patterns, as if mocking our presence. Brandon pivoted slowly, his breath ragged. Tyler stood behind him, trembling. Then I saw it. A tall silhouette stepping from behind a boulder. Its limbs were elongated, the joints all wrong. Glowing yellowish eyes fixed on Brandon. Brandon roared, charging at it with the knife raised. The figure let out a distorted hiss, sidestepping with agile speed. Tyler tried to swing the hatchet, but struck only empty air. The entity lunged forward, swiping at Brandon with bony fingers. Brandon fell backward, scraping his elbow on the rocky ground. I screamed, adrenaline surging. The flashlight beam danced across the figure's half-hidden features, patches of what might have been hair or hide, a face twisted in a bestial grimace. In that split second, I thought for sure Brandon was a goner. Yet the creature paused, leaning in close to sniff or assess him, the stench intensifying. Tyler yanked Brandon away just in time. With a snarl that sounded almost human, the figure retreated a few steps. I shone the flashlight directly in its eyes, and it recoiled, hissing. Maybe it hated the light, or maybe it was toying with us. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight, but I kept it aimed at the creature, step by trembling step. We inched back toward the RV. The figure circled around, letting out an eerie, almost mocking hiss. Tyler hauled Brandon to his feet. Maya from inside screamed, "Hurry!" We managed to reach the door, and the four of us tumbled inside. Brandon was panting, a trickle of blood running down his arm, but otherwise unhurt. He slammed the door, double latching it. My mind reeled. That thing could have torn him apart if it wanted to. Why did it hesitate? We waited, breathless. For a moment, silence. Then the RV shook again. The creature pounded on the side, rocking us. Maya clung to me, sobbing. Tyler braced himself against a cupboard, holding the hatchet in a white-knuckled grip. Brandon glared at the walls as if daring them to break. My flashlight flickered, its batteries dying. "No, no, no," I muttered, fumbling for spares in the first aid kit. My fingers trembled so badly I dropped them twice. Finally, I managed to swap them and the light returned. We cowered there for hours, or so it felt. In reality, Maybe it was only until the sky started to lighten. At one point, the pounding stopped. The hiss grew distant, as if the creature was prowling around outside, circling, waiting. We didn't dare open the door again. At the first hint of dawn, the forest around us began to stir with normal sounds. Birds, a breeze through the leaves. We didn't relax, but we gathered ourselves. If the RV wasn't drivable, we'd have to make a run for it on foot. The nearest ranger station was miles away, but maybe we'd find a main road or pass someone along the way. Brandon tested the ignition again, still dead. Tyler rummaged for a compass and realized we'd drifted off our original route. We had to navigate by guesswork. Our final dash from the clearing was one long, nerve-wracking ordeal. We took only essentials, leaving behind heavier gear. Maya's wrist throbbed, but she held on to me, determined. Brandon carried his knife, Tyler the hatchet, while I kept the flashlight. We stepped out, half expecting an ambush, but the creature was nowhere to be seen. That morning sun felt feeble as it tried to burn off the fog. We walked as fast as we dared, hearts pounding at every snapped twig or rustle of leaves. For a while, the path we carved was random. We only knew we had to keep going downhill, hoping it would lead to a main trail. My boots squelched in damp mud. The deeper we went, the thicker the underbrush became, lashing at our legs. Maya's breathing was ragged. Brandon stopped occasionally to listen. Tyler made a half-hearted joke. This is definitely how all my nightmares start. None of us laughed. Eventually, we stumbled onto a faint path, which, after an hour or more, led us to a gravel service road. I nearly cried with relief when I saw actual tire tracks in the dirt. We followed them, ignoring the pain in our limbs. Overhead, the sun was finally breaking through. The forest here felt different, less oppressive, more alive. Maybe the threat was gone. After another 30 minutes of limping along, we spotted a small sign for a ranger station about 2 miles away. It was the best sight I'd seen in my life. We pressed on, ignoring hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. Step by step, we escaped Shining Rock's grip. When we arrived at the ranger station, a lone car was parked out front. A middle-aged ranger with a graying beard greeted us, startled by our disheveled appearance. We babbled about a monster, strange footprints, attacks on our RV. He eyed us with skepticism, though he didn't dismiss us outright. Brandon showed him the cuts on his arm, and Maya revealed her sprained wrist. Tyler explained the weird footprints around our site. The ranger frowned, said something about black bears, or maybe a rabid animal. We knew it was neither. Still, the ranger drove us into town, and from there we got to a hospital to check out Maya's wrist and Brandon's injuries. While waiting, I scrolled through my phone, reading a snippet of local folklore. Within the Shining Rock region, there have long been tales of malevolent spirits, described by explorers as gaunt figures with luminous eyes, witches, wendigo, or some ancient evil. The text gave me chills. We'd seen it, smelled it, nearly been mauled by it. No one died that night, and part of me wonders if it let us go on purpose. The memory of that monster's glowing eyes still haunts me, especially how it seemed to relish our terror. Sometimes I think it feeds on fear, draining life from those who wander too far into its domain. Or maybe there's a tragic story behind it. Maybe it was human once. I don't know. What I do know is that I'll never set foot in that section of the wilderness again. Our RV was eventually towed, but I doubt we'll ever see it in working shape. The side was clawed and dented, the windows streaked with that greasy residue I can't forget. Insurance covered part of the cost, but the nightmares aren't so easily paid off. Maya tries not to talk about it. She flinches whenever someone mentions camping. Tyler cracks jokes in public, but I've seen him stare off into space, lost in anxious memories. Brandon, for all his bravado, hasn't done a wilderness trip since, at least not anywhere near as isolated. And me? I dream sometimes that I'm back in the darkness, hearing that scraping on the walls, the hiss just outside. I jolt awake, my heart hammering, and I can't shake the feeling that something got in that night. Not physically, but in my mind. Part of me is always waiting for that sulfuric stench, for the flicker of those eyes in my periphery. I've told this story to a few people I trust. Some roll their eyes, some listen in wide-eyed fascination, but no one can truly grasp it except the four of us who lived it. They say the Shining Rock Wilderness is breathtakingly beautiful, a crown jewel of Pisgah, but beneath that beauty lurks something ancient and malevolent. I once asked the ranger if he'd heard of any missing persons up there, and he gave a vague nod, saying it happens occasionally. Hikers get lost, weather turns bad. But now I wonder how many might have ended up in that quartz clearing, face to face with the thing that prowls under the cold moon. So that's my story, the reason I believe in horrors that defy logic. I'm Jessica Barnes, 27, once a happy skeptic, now living with the knowledge that not every legend is just a legend. If you ever decide to go off the grid in places like Shining Rock, remember this. There are watchers in those woods. Maybe witches, maybe Wendigo, maybe some other nameless evil. If you hear scraping on the walls at night, or see elongated footprints outside your camper, think carefully before you open the door. And whatever you do, don't shine a flashlight in its eyes, because if you see it clearly, that means it sees you too. My name is Ethan Morris. I'm 32 years old, and what I'm about to share took place in the heart of North Carolina's Croatan National Forest. It wasn't my first solo trip, but it's the one I'll never forget. I'm a freelance photographer who travels the country in a refurbished RV, chasing the unusual and offbeat landscapes that magazines always seem to hunger for. I've seen all manner of strange sights, rare wildlife, weather phenomena, but nothing quite like what I encountered in those swamps and pine forests near the coast. My arrival at Croatan was fueled by a need for solitude. A few months earlier, I'd broken off my engagement, and I guess I was searching for a sense of independence or maybe just a quiet place to let my thoughts settle. I chose Croatan for its raw, untamed beauty, the cypress swamps, the coastal marshes, and the thick pine stands that turn a golden hue at sundown. I wanted new photographs, yes, but I also wanted to be alone in a place that felt unspoiled by crowds. I reached the forest in late afternoon. The sun was sliding behind a haze of clouds, painting the horizon gray and orange. My RV is an older model I bought cheap and spent a year fixing up. Part of that fix-up involved installing solar panels to power my camera equipment, laptop, and a few basic appliances. It's never been perfect, but at least it usually works well enough to keep me connected when I need it, except, of course, on the day I pulled into Croatan. My battery display started flashing error codes as soon as I turned onto the gravel road leading deeper into the wilderness. I remember cursing under my breath, tapping the panel like a stubborn child. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rising, though I told myself it was just nerves. I spotted a dirt spur that widened enough for me to park. Surrounded by tall pines, with a shallow drainage ditch on one side and a patch of coastal wetlands on the other, it was isolated enough. I wasn't expecting amenities out here. I set the RV's parking brake, hopped out, and took a deep breath. The air smelled sweet and earthy, tinged with hints of brine drifting in from the nearby coast. I tilted my head to listen. There was the distant croak of frogs in the marsh, the hum of insects, and a subtle rustling of the pines. It felt alive, yet oddly watchful. I did a quick equipment check. My main digital camera was at half battery. My phone was around 70%. The laptop I used for editing was fully charged, at least. But if my solar panels kept misbehaving, I'd have to ration energy. I tried not to dwell on that. I wanted to enjoy my first evening in Croatan, maybe snap a few shots of twilight. Before I could get the tripod set up, I heard the drone of an engine. A dusty pickup rumbled by, pulling a small boat behind it. A man with a weathered face and a thick beard slowed down and gave me a curious nod. He stopped alongside my RV and rolled down his window. "Evening," he said. looking me up and down. He was lean, probably in his 50s, wearing a baseball cap that had seen better days. "Evening," I replied. "Name's Ethan," he nodded. "Tom Saunders. Folks call me Red. You new around here?" "Just arrived, actually. Doing some photography, maybe some bird watching if I'm lucky." He scratched his cheek, leaving a faint smear of dust. "You alone out here?" I hesitated, thinking about how some people might advise never to admit you're traveling solo, but something in his manner suggested he wasn't a threat. "Yeah, I'm on my own." "Brave," he said, then jerked his head at the forest. "Heard the Croatan's full of ghost stories, you know. Voices in the marshes and all that. Could be spooky if you're not used to it." I offered a half smile. "I like a good story. I'll be fine." He shrugged. "All right. I'll be fishing near Cahook Creek for a couple of days. I usually camp a mile that way." He pointed toward an unmarked turn. "In case you want some company or run into trouble." I thanked him, and he drove off, boat trailer rattling behind him. I wasn't sure if it was neighborly concern or if he was spooked by my presence, but something about his warning felt sincere. A breeze passed through the pines, rustling the needles like a distant whisper. With the sun almost gone, I decided on a short walk to get a feel for the area. I locked up the RV, slung my camera over my shoulder, and headed along a narrow footpath that cut into the trees. The last of the daylight filtered through the canopy, painting everything in gold and shadow. Now and then, I paused to snap pictures of interesting fungi clinging to logs or the silhouette of twisted cypress roots at the water's edge. I got some decent shots, but I also noticed the forest growing quiet in an unnatural way. Sometimes you can sense the hush of wildlife bedding down, but this was different, like a silence that was imposed, pressing in from all sides. I tried to brush it off, focusing on the damp earth underfoot and the sweet tang in the air. Then I heard it. Laughter. Light, high-pitched, echoing from some distance, almost like children at play. Yet it didn't belong. There were no houses, no campsites, no roads nearby. The small bit of hair left on my neck prickled again. I listened carefully, but the laughter died on the wind. After a moment's hesitation, I turned back. Night was coming on fast, and I didn't want to get lost. Back at the RV, I set up a small propane stove to cook dinner. Just a can of chili, simple enough. With the stove hissing away, I checked the solar panel display. A bright red error code glared at me. "Battery draining," it said. No reason why. I sighed and stirred the chili. My supply of propane was decent, but if my electrical system was failing, I'd be in trouble for phone and camera charging. Could be a short circuit, or maybe the panels were damaged. After dinner, I tidied up and settled onto the small couch in the RV to review the day's photos. They mostly turned out well, except for one shot that was entirely black. I remembered taking it at the water's edge when I thought I saw something flicker between the trees. The metadata said it was a proper exposure, but the file showed complete darkness except for a few faint streaks of gray. I frowned, but chalked it up to an error. The night felt long. I dozed off to the croaking of frogs and the buzz of cicadas, and then woke up around midnight, startled by a new sound. It was faint but insistent, like murmured voices just outside the RV. My heart hammered as I grabbed a flashlight and peered through the window. Nothing but dark pines and shifting shadows. When the voices persisted, I opened the door a crack. Only the hush of the forest. The moment I shut it again, I thought I heard a single word. My name, Ethan, whispered in the breeze. Then silence. Eventually, adrenaline fading, I slumped back into bed and forced myself into an uneasy sleep. Morning light came as a relief. I felt groggy but determined to figure out what was going on with my solar. Stepping outside, I surveyed the panels on top of the RV. Nothing looked physically damaged. The battery connections seemed tight, though a bit of condensation coated the wires. I patted them dry with a cloth and tried to reset the system. No luck. My phone showed 49% battery. My camera was at 28%. Not good for a multi-day trip in the wilderness. I decided to drive deeper into the forest, find a more open spot for the solar panels. Maybe I just needed better sun. I wasn't on the gravel road for 5 minutes when I spotted a park ranger vehicle pulled off at a bend. A woman in uniform with short brown hair stood looking at the trunk of a longleaf pine. I recognized the chance for local guidance, so I pulled over. Her name tag read Hendricks. She introduced herself as Sarah Hendricks. Her voice was warm, her posture professional. She asked for my permit, which I had purchased online, and I showed her the digital copy on my phone. Then she asked if I needed any help or information. "Actually, I do," I said, explaining my solar troubles. "I might need a better place to set up, somewhere with more direct sunlight." She nodded. "If you head toward the cedar swamps near Mill Creek, you'll find a small clearing. That might help." Her tone was friendly, but she tensed as I mentioned some of the strange noises I'd heard in the night. Instead of rolling her eyes at my story, she listened carefully, then said, "This area has a lot of folklore. Some people claim to hear voices, something about old settlers who vanished. Try not to wander off designated trails. Our rescue operations can be tricky in the swamp." I thanked her. She gave me directions, adding in a low voice, "Be careful out there. A lot of folks go off-grid in Croatan, and not all of them come back with good stories." I left, a knot forming in my stomach. Her concern made me even more uneasy. Still, I had a job to do, so I followed her directions and soon found a clearing by a stand of cedar trees. I parked the RV, angled the panels for maximum exposure, and hopped out to set up a mini tripod for some overhead shots of the swampland. Through the telephoto lens, I picked out sunbeams cutting through the morning mist. That was when I noticed another figure with a camera across the marsh, maybe 100 yards away. I waved, a little excited. Another photographer in the wild. She looked up, noticed me, and waved back. A few minutes later, she maneuvered over the wet ground to reach my clearing. She was maybe late 20s, short hair, and carried a professional-grade DSLR. She introduced herself as Mia Dawson. She'd come to photograph the bird life, particularly woodpeckers and owls. We traded pleasantries about lens preferences and vantage points. She asked how long I'd be around, and I told her about my plan to stay several days. "Hope you have better luck than I did last night," she said, making a face. "I was on a boardwalk trail around dusk, and I saw these lights moving through the woods, like little lanterns. No explanation. Then my camera battery drained. I felt a shiver down my spine. It was too close to my own experience to dismiss. "Same here," I admitted, and told her about the laughter and voices. She chuckled nervously. "I guess it's just us spooking ourselves, right?" But neither of us looked entirely convinced. We parted ways, agreeing to maybe connect again if we crossed paths. I spent the rest of that morning trying to get some solid shots. The twisting cypress knees that rose like stalagmites from the marsh, the reflection of pines in still water. Despite the beauty, I couldn't shake a sense of being watched. Multiple times I paused, camera halfway up, sure I'd seen movement in the trees. But every time I looked carefully, there was nothing. Around midday, I returned to the RV for lunch, only to find small handprints in the wet mud near my driver's side door. They were too small to be an adult's, maybe a child's, but there was no campsite nearby, no family with kids. My pulse quickened. The prints were strangely well-defined, as though someone with wet fingers had pressed them deliberately. Who would be out here creeping around my RV? I took a photo of them on my phone, a shaky, nervous shot that I almost regretted capturing. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe a tourist with a kid had wandered by. There were no footprints leading away, though, just those tiny, muddied hands. The air felt heavier, like I was being pulled into a place I didn't belong. I forced myself to eat a quick sandwich, ignoring the uneasy knot in my stomach. Later that afternoon, I decided to drive to a boat ramp area I'd seen marked on the ranger's map, hoping for some scenic water shots. On the way, I passed a small clearing where I spotted a familiar truck with a boat trailer, Tom Saunders, or Red, the fisherman. He was roasting something over a small fire at the edge of a swamp pond, I almost drove by, but the memory of the weirdness made me think maybe he knew more local tales. I parked, walked over, and said hello. He offered me a seat on an overturned bucket, and we chatted about the day's catch. Eventually, I brought up the odd voices at night and the handprints I'd seen. He stared into his fire, expression growing distant. "You wouldn't be the first to hear voices," he said quietly. "Old stories say that some of the first colonists who tried to settle inland vanished without a trace. Their ghosts are said to roam the wetlands calling out." I shifted uncomfortably. "You ever heard anything yourself?" He poked at the coals. "Couple times. Might have just been the wind. But I once stayed too long out on the water, and I swear I heard children laughing near the banks. Went to check, found nobody." A chill swept through me. "Yeah, that's what I heard too." He gave me a meaningful look. "Croatan's bigger than folks realize. Plenty of places to get lost, physically and otherwise." That phrase stuck with me as I headed back to the RV at dusk. The day's photography session had yielded fewer pictures than usual. My camera battery was now critically low. Why, I couldn't be sure. The solar charge had barely budged. That night I tried to edit some shots on my laptop, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept drifting to the voices, the small handprints, the flickering lights Mia had seen. I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of tapping, not on the window or the door, but on the walls of the RV itself, as though tiny knuckles were rapping in a slow, irregular rhythm. My heart raced. Part of me wanted to fling open the door and chase whoever was out there, but fear kept me frozen. The tapping stopped. Then came a childlike whisper, "Please, help." My blood ran cold. I held my breath, certain I was dreaming. "Help!" the voice repeated, closer now. Sweat trickled down the back of my neck. I turned on my flashlight and with trembling steps moved to the door. I cracked it open, shining the beam around. The clearing lay in silver moonlight. I saw no one, no footprints, nothing. Then, from the corner of my vision, I thought I saw a shape slipping between the trees, a small figure. Before I could do anything, the figure vanished into the dark swamp. My flashlight caught a brief outline of a child, pale and flickering, but I can't be certain. My breathing came in shallow gasps. Closing the door, I locked it, feeling more helpless than ever. I sat up the rest of the night, refusing to sleep. If that was a real child, I'd have found footprints. If it was an animal, the voice wouldn't be so clear. Finally, exhaustion claimed me just before dawn. When I woke, the forest was awash in morning light. My head felt heavy, my muscles ached. I checked my phone. 31% battery left. I had to do something. I couldn't just keep staying alone in these deeper sections of Croatan. Anxiety gnawed at me. I decided to follow the ranger's advice more literally. Stick to marked trails, stay near known camping spots. At least that way, if something happened, there was a chance of rescue. I managed to drive the RV a short distance before it started sputtering. Perhaps water had gotten into the engine's electronics. Moisture is a killer in swampy environments. I coaxed it along until it died completely on a dirt road that cut through a patch of boggy ground. My heart sank. I tried the ignition again. A weak click. I cursed under my breath. Before panic could fully set in, a bright spotlight cut through the early morning haze. Ranger Hendrix's truck. She pulled up, her expression turning to concern when she saw me slumped over the RV's steering wheel. "Trouble again?" she asked. "More than I can handle," I confessed, forcing a laugh that had no real humor behind it. Then I explained how the RV's engine gave out, about hearing voices at night and seeing that strange figure. She listened patiently, no judgment in her eyes. "Let's see if we can get you and your vehicle to safer ground," she said. We spent the next hour trying to jump-start the RV with her truck, but the battery refused to hold a charge. She offered to tow me if I had a rope or chain, but I only had a short length of cable, not nearly enough to do the job. Finally, she suggested I lock up the RV and ride with her to a nearby ranger station. They had a generator that might help, plus a phone line to call for a proper tow. I hesitated. not wanting to abandon my home on wheels, but I saw no other option. At the small ranger station, a modest wooden building near a shallow creek, Hendricks introduced me to a couple of her colleagues. They eyed me with mild curiosity as I recounted my experiences, skipping none of the bizarre details. Their skepticism was clear, though they tried to be polite about it. One older ranger patted me on the shoulder, saying, "Sometimes, the swamp can play tricks on your mind, especially if you're tired or stressed." Fatigue made me less defensive than usual. "Maybe," I said, but I knew what I heard and saw. While they coordinated a tow, I scrolled through the photos on my camera, hoping the ghostly figure might have appeared. Most of my images were normal: trees, water, birds. Then I stumbled upon one frame that made my heart lurch, a shot I'd taken at dusk, near the marsh. The corner of the image showed a semi-transparent shape of a small child's face, eyes wide. It was faint, as if superimposed on the background, but unmistakable once you noticed it. I stared, pulse pounding. Was it a trick of the light, a lens flare, or something else? I showed it to Ranger Hendricks. She frowned, trying to make sense of it. "Might be a reflection," she said gently, but her voice lacked conviction. "You sure you were alone when you took this?" "Positive," I whispered. She handed back the camera, her brow knitted in concern. "Well, the tow truck will arrive in a few hours. You're welcome to wait here or—" Suddenly, the station's radio crackled, interrupting her. A call came through about a missing hiker near the swamps. The Rangers darted into action, grabbing gear. Hendricks apologized, explaining she had to join the search. I sat there, the faint hum of electricity from a single overhead bulb reminding me how vulnerable I'd been in the dark. With the Rangers gone, I thought about calling a friend or family member, but phone service here was spotty. The station's landline was available, yet I felt reluctant to call anyone to explain. "Hey, I'm stuck in Croatan, and I might be haunted." It sounded absurd even to me. Instead, I decided to get some fresh air, stepping onto the small porch out front. I watched the pine trees sway gently in the midday breeze, their green needles glistening with leftover dew. All seemed peaceful, but I couldn't shake the memory of the voice whispering my name, or the child's face in the photo. The sun was climbing high, warming my shoulders. For a moment, I closed my eyes, letting the forest sounds wash over me. A rustling near the edge of the station's yard made me jump. It was just a squirrel. I sighed, feeling paranoid. Time dragged. I popped inside to see if I could boil water and make coffee to keep myself alert. The place was eerily quiet without the Rangers. While waiting for the kettle, I flipped through a dusty binder labeled Local Folklore and Incidents, presumably a resource for visitors. It included accounts of strange sightings, phantom lights drifting among the cypress, apparitions of colonial-era people dressed in tattered garments, voices calling from the water. One short entry mentioned a rumor that some children from an early settlement disappeared in the marsh, never found. A chill prickled over my scalp. That childlike whisper, the small face in my photograph. The kettle whistled, jolting me. I poured the coffee, my hand trembling a bit. The binder's final note on that page read, "Cause of disappearance remains unknown. Locals attribute it to ghostly spirits trapped in the swamp, forever calling for help." I snapped the binder shut, my appetite for reading gone. Hours later, a battered tow truck rattled up the station's gravel driveway. A lanky mechanic hopped out, introduced himself as Dale, and we drove in his truck back toward where my RV sat. The road was rough, and the hush of twilight settled around us by the time we arrived. Dale attached a heavy-duty chain to the RV's undercarriage, hooking the other end to his truck. A part of me feared we'd see footprints again, or a shadowy figure lurking behind the pines, but the place looked empty under the fading sky. It took Dale some effort to yank the RV out of the mud. Once it was free, we towed it carefully along the dirt road. I rode with him in the cab, white-knuckled as the chain strained and creaked. At last, we reached more solid ground. He offered to bring it back to his garage on the outskirts of the forest. I didn't hesitate to say yes. I'd had enough of Croatan's remote corners. My plan was to call it quits on this trip, at least for now. Darkness set in, turning the pines into silent sentinels flanking the road. The rhythmic clang of the chain between the truck and my RV was oddly soothing after so many nerve-wracking nights. But as we rounded a bend, a flicker of light caught my attention in the side mirror. My breath caught. It looked like a single lantern bobbing among the distant trees. And then, for an instant, I saw what looked like a child's silhouette. The figure paused, raising one hand, as though in farewell, or perhaps beckoning me back. I stared, not sure if my eyes were playing tricks. Dale must have noticed me tense, because he asked, "Something wrong?" I hesitated, then just shook my head. No, must be seeing things. He shrugged and kept driving, eventually striking up a conversation about local festivals, trying to lighten the mood. We left the forest behind. The garage sat in a small town half an hour away. Streetlights and the glow of shop windows felt like a return to civilization. My RV was in sorry shape, but at least it was out of Croatan's clutches. Dale said he'd look at the engine in the morning, see if it was salvageable. I thanked him, then hopped on my phone to book a cheap motel for the night, anything with a working lock and steady electricity. Settling into that motel room, I felt an odd mix of relief and lingering dread. I realized I still had the memory card from my camera. When I plugged it into my laptop, I carefully reviewed each photo. There, in a handful of frames, were anomalies. Faint streaks of light in broad daylight, slight distortions in the shapes of trees, and that singular image of the child's face. It almost looked sorrowful, trapped behind a veil of static. I forwarded the photo to my personal email, half tempted to share it with paranormal groups online. But some semblance of caution stopped me. Part of me feared that no matter how convincing the picture might be, no one would believe the full story. Worse yet, maybe attention would follow me, and I'd never escape the ghostly whispers. The whole notion made my skin crawl. I barely slept that night, haunted by the silent pleas behind that child's expression. My dreams were full of waterlogged cabins, small footprints leading nowhere, and the sensation of being pulled into murky depths by unseen hands. When I woke at dawn, sweat soaked my pillow, and my heart pounded like I'd run a marathon. After showering and grabbing a stale pastry from the motel lobby, I walked to Dale's garage. He shook his head gravely. "This rig's an electrical nightmare," he said. He suspected water damage to the wiring, plus the solar array needed a full overhaul. It wouldn't be quick or cheap. I nodded, half listening, half lost in the swirl of everything that had happened. My life on the road was stalled indefinitely, but at least I was safe. The next few days blurred together. Me bouncing from the garage to the motel, waiting on parts to arrive and repairs to be done. Each night I'd feel uneasy, as if the marsh was calling me back. Occasionally I'd jolt awake, convinced I heard faint laughter. I told myself it was just residual fear and stress, yet the memory of the child's face remained lodged in my mind. By the time the RV was roadworthy again, nearly a week had passed since my first night in Croatan. I considered returning to capture more photos, some irrational desire to bring closure to the experience. But the sensible part of me knew better. I'd never forget the whispered voices, the muddy handprints, the illusions, or perhaps truths, of ghostly figures in the swamp. I'd gotten what I needed, a real, potent reminder that not everything can be explained by my camera lens or rational thought. When I finally pulled out of Dale's lot, I headed straight west, away from the coast. The morning light was strong, the sky clear, as though urging me forward. The RV hummed, still a bit battered, but functional. My phone had full battery. I had a fresh memory card in the camera, but my appetite for exploring remote corners of that forest was gone. Miles later, I glanced in the side mirror out of habit. The highway behind me was empty except for a few distant cars. But in the reflection, maybe just for an instant, I thought I saw a small flicker of light in the distance, like a lantern waving farewell. My stomach clenched, and I snapped my gaze back to the road. It could have been a reflection or a trick of the sun. It could have been nothing. I kept driving, determined not to look back again. Eventually, I turned on the radio, searching for a local station. Static for a few seconds, then a faint broadcast crackled through. The weatherman predicted sunny days and mild nights. No mention of ghosts or lost children. No mention of travelers who heard voices calling them from the pines. Just the ordinary concerns of everyday life. But for me, Croatan's hush and those fleeting voices are burned into my mind. Whenever I park the RV in a secluded spot, I still find myself listening for that child's whisper, checking the mud around my wheels for small handprints. I've told a few close friends the watered-down version of this story. They arch their brows, smile politely, and change the subject. I can't blame them. It's a difficult story to believe, one I can hardly process myself. Some nights, I dream about heading back, braving the swamp and the phantom lights, perhaps to release those lost voices from whatever curse binds them. But in the harsh clarity of dawn, I know it's not my place to meddle. The Croatan National Forest is older and more mysterious than any lens can capture. There are forces there, whether you call them ghosts, echoes of history, or illusions born of fear, that defy tidy explanations. All I'm left with are memories and a single photograph. A half-invisible child's face, eyes pleading, forever etched into the shadows of cypress and water. I'm Ethan Morris, 32, a photographer by trade, and I left Croatan with more questions than answers. That place, those voices, I still feel them, lurking on the edges of my thoughts, reminding me that not every secret in the wild is meant to be discovered. And sometimes, what's lost is never truly gone.